Dr. Berry, licensed psychologist, and I love covering expert testimony, specifically experts in the field of clinical or forensic psychology. And I like breaking this down so that we can all understand. I have not gotten through the cross examination yet. I got about maybe halfway through direct examination by the defense. So Dr. Brannon is on the stand. He is a licensed psychologist in the state of Florida, and he did not examine Sarah Boone. This is the day 4 of Sarah Boone's trial, and she testified yesterday. I did cover that, and I do have the playlist, all of my previous Sarah Boone coverage in one altogether playlist. I thought Cross was going to be good, and I ended up with 2 cancellations. Anyone who was with us yesterday or last night, I was not planning to go live tomorrow, and but I was really looking forward to this. And so let's go on ahead and hop in. We've already gotten through his credentials. I did think he was going to come across as a pretty strong witness. He is not here to say whether Sarah Boone has battered spouse syndrome or battered partner syndrome. He is just talking about this in general. The state is going to appropriately object at times, and we are going to talk about this. So they're at the point in his testimony where they're asking him about how many times he's brought in by the defense and how often he's brought in by the prosecution. And sometimes it can be 50-50.
This time, Your Honor, I'll proffer the witness as an expert in the field of forensic psychology.
Yes, approach.
And so they tried to enter him as an expert in forensic psychology, but I do think that they were supposed to enter him as an expert in clinical psychology. If you go back to some of the things that were filed, because I think the state wants him entered as a clinical psychologist who's giving expert testimony in the field of battered partner syndrome. I do not think the state wants him entered as a forensic expert, because then I think he can give his opinion in general. In a case like this, could Sarah Boone meet the legal criteria? And so I think that's why the state is fighting this a little. I'm going to be able to fast forward through there.
Wait.
Sorry, let me go back.
Objection is sustained. Wait.
So the objection was sustained. Y'all know I'm not a lawyer. He does have the expertise to be entered as...
Objection is still sustained. Mr. Beck, you may continue.
Has battered spouse syndrome been accepted, to your knowledge, in the Florida court system?
Yes, sir.
Objection, legal conclusion.
Sustained.
Can you describe the classic system or systemology wherein an individual might necessarily suffer and then exhibit symptoms of battered women syndrome?
Yes. So battered spouse syndrome is a woman, usually a woman's response, doesn't have to be, but that's a classic historical research went into how women respond in situations in which there's intimate partner violence, when they've been the victim of violence. Now we know, of course, in other kinds of relationships, men can be a victim of it as well, or whether it's a heterosexual or homosexual relationship, that both men and women can be victims. But we still know the majority of those individuals that are diagnosed with that condition or given that condition, classified with that condition, are women.
Bless you.
We do know that it's a reaction, a strategy that's developed by the person who's being abused to someone who's abusing them in an intimate partner situation. And essentially what they're doing is they've made a determination that they can't effectively escape from the abuse. They can't just leave for some reason. They feel in danger, or they've been threatened if they leave that something bad will happen to them. So it's a cognitive or thinking strategy on the part of the person being abused that I have to develop some coping skills or ways of protecting myself and protecting myself or maybe even loved ones as well from some form of imminent violence or danger or lethality. Something bad will happen to me if I don't develop a way of handling this abuse, this constant abuse that's coming towards me. So the battered wife syndrome is really a way of thinking. It's a psychological change that happens with a victim in terms of the way they cope and strategize to stay safe for themselves and other loved ones as well, oftentimes.
And that is all so accurate. So battered spouse syndrome is real. And I do just want to say, I do think that George inflicted some wounds on Sarah. And I think Sarah inflicted some wounds on him. And to me, I don't think death by suitcase is an appropriate battered spouse, my own personal thing, but this is going to be up to the jury. It's not typical. And she seemed to be the one with the control in the relationship. She had way more control and privilege than he did. She had more money than him. She had the car. She had the means to buy the alcohol. It's so hard, but we're going to keep going. And I'm not sure if he's mentioned it yet, and he might be about to get to it, but battered spouse or battered partner syndrome, it's not in the DSM-5. It's looked at more like PTSD or one of the trauma and stressor related disorders.
I'm going to ask a really silly question, if I may, doctor. I don't know if you've noticed a bruise across the bridge of my nose this morning.
I did see that when I come in. Yes, sir.
Okay. This weekend, okay. Hypothetically, if an individual was digging around in the garbage, the lid fell down and cut his nose, the bridge of his nose wide open, would you as a forensic psychologist anticipate, or a psychologist in general, anticipate that there might be a physical or a psychological reaction or response to that degree of trauma?
So I don't know if it would be trauma or not. It could be, depending on the degree of the injury and the pain and things like that. But certainly you'd view that garbage can differently as you approached it. So it changes your psychology or the way that you look at that particular situation or that particular object. So by viewing it differently, you may engage in different behaviors. You may approach it differently. You may have somebody else approach it. You may approach it with both hands up. So it changes your behavior and your thinking about that garbage can.
Does that also apply to interpersonal relationships?
So it certainly can. No two people always react the same way to every situation. Trauma, one person's trauma is not a trauma to another person. But for people who do develop battered spouse syndrome, they do begin to change the way they view the person who's abusing them and what they have to do in order to maintain either their life or their safety, their physical safety in terms of their behavior and interactions with that person.
Now, is there a specific set of criteria that a psychologist, forensic psychologist?
We are here for the interruptions, okay? And because Marianne Coates asked a really good question, and I wanted to bring up something that I don't think I went far enough. I was trying to think of the emotion. I have a whole feelings wheel pillow. Okay, I need to go to the angry. I was furious. I don't know, like I was infuriated to hear Sarah Boone talk about when he was trying to get out of the suitcase that she was telling him, stop doing this to me. Ma'am, stop doing this to me. Like, even in this last moment of his life, she is still centering herself and her needs and what she wants and what she needs. And she's making herself the victim. And he is the one who's trapped in a suitcase. And he's already said, I can't breathe. And she's thinking it's the boy crying wolf. No, he really couldn't breathe. And so that part, I don't think she meant for it to come off that way, but to me it came off harmful to me. That was my interpretation of it. And it was very problematic. But back to the question. when she was reliving that moment and told him, please don't go, please don't get out, please don't go. I wonder if he was trying to leave her. So I did miss that during her direct. During my conversation with Misha and Tanika last night. If you missed that live last night, you can go back and watch it. But in that, we talked more about, was he trying to leave her? Was he packing his suitcase from the second floor? Was he in their room packing his suitcase to leave? And was he planning to leave her? I still don't think the neighbors, I think the neighbors have it right. The night something loud came down the steps, because I think if it was Sarah, she would have been screaming and yelling at him. I don't think it would have been this, because they just described hearing a loud noise coming down. Yeah. All right, let's keep it going.
Would necessarily rely upon in attempting to make a diagnosis or an assessment of battered women's syndrome.
Yes, sir.
And what are those criteria?
Well, you'd want to see, one, if some type of abuse has occurred. That abuse can be physical, it can be sexual, it can be emotional, or it can just be the threat of abuse or bad things that's going to happen to you. So there has to be something bad that's happened or that's threatened to be happening over a period of time. So abuse has to be present in order for this to be underway. Without abuse, there's no battered wife syndrome. But that's not enough. There also has to be what's called coercive control. Coercive control is really keeping the person's social interactions, overseen on a regular basis.
How was he the one coercively controlling her? She was the one monitoring his phone and social media. She was the one who had the car, who was screaming. And so he's going to mention screaming and yelling in the background while someone's on the phone. That was Sarah. That wasn't George. That was Sarah.
Just controlling money, controlling preferences, even TV preferences, sometimes social media, looking at social media that the person is accessing or looking at, who they're talking to on Facebook, who they're texting. So it's a combination of abuse and coercive control that results in a person feeling victimized, but that's still not enough. That person then has to feel like they can't escape from that. They've either been told, if you leave me, you're going to die, or a family member is going to be harmed, your children, your mother, whatever it might be. And as a result of that, they develop strategies to cope with that, acquiescing, pleasing, doing anything they're asked to do, demeaning themselves, allowing themselves to be controlled. All of the things that would fend off, if you will, some abuse or attack or threat to them or someone who surrounds them. So those would be the components that you would need to have. And that dance continues to go on, usually repeatedly throughout the course of that relationship.
So I think what you're describing is, in a sense, a subjective nature to the syndrome that's being described.
It's both objective and subjective. So objective in terms of the facts, like what's really happening. A person's being abused, they're being told certain things, there's control over them. But then the subjective part is the person's interpretation of that, their perception of that. So there's really both going on, and they have to kind of work together in order for this syndrome to be formalized and properly diagnosed.
You indicated that there's sometimes maybe some defense mechanisms that are, or strategies that are devised by the battered individual, the abused individual.
My bad. I was trying to respond to Christine, and there's some button I can push that makes everything go away to like stop share. I'm gonna have to turn that button off because whoops. All right, we got to go back because they're getting into substances right now. All right, we are professionals here. We are. I kind of like this view a little bit more. We might see how this one goes. All right, let's keep it going.
Indicated that there's sometimes maybe some defense mechanisms that are, or strategies that are devised by the battered individual, the abused individual.
Yes, sir.
In your experience and your training, do controlled substances, alcohol, drugs, frequently appear in your analysis or assessment?
Yes, and the way they appear is they can appear either from the abuser or the abused or both. What can happen from the abuser standpoint is they may only be abusive, or the abuse may become worse if they abuse substances. From the abused standpoint, it may be self-medication. It may be a way of coping with the anxiety that there's going to be something bad that potentially could happen to them or somebody else. It's kind of a way of dealing with walking on the eggshells. So if I use substances, that can deaden the pain, if you will, for me, or help me to forget about it. So it's oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes part of either the abuser's behavior or the abused behavior.
Do they, in your experience, do they on occasion actually defend?
But I wonder if they're going to bring in, so state, if you are watching, Sarah was abusing alcohol before she ever alleged any physical harm. Because I think she's reporting that this relationship was her only unsafe relationship. Brian was not an unsafe relationship. And she started abusing alcohol in that relationship. And when she was intoxicated, she would become aggressive towards Brian. I think that testimony is going to come in later through Brian.
And the individual that is abusing them.
That's a very frequent part of this syndrome. Not always, but it's very frequent. It's why interviewing them becomes difficult sometimes, because they're used to explaining away their behavior, the abuser's behavior, my black eye, my missing tooth, his screaming and yelling in the background while I'm talking to mom on the phone. So they're used to making excuses for it. It's part of the coping strategy, trying to explain away this behavior. He's had a bad day. She's, really upset about something else that's going on. She's really never like this at any other time. So defending that person is oftentimes a part of the battered spouse syndrome, and getting the person who's been abused to get them to stop defending them so they can talk about the actual abuse becomes a challenge.
Now, the DSM makes reference on occasion to rule outs, I assume for the diagnosis that's being applied. What is a rule out?
A rule out in our parlance says that we should consider these things before we look at other diagnoses. So, for instance, if we're going to consider schizophrenia, we should rule out substance abuse first, because oftentimes some drugs can create hallucinations and delusions and psychotic symptoms. So there's always rule out, just like there are for medical conditions. So look for this before you consider this, is really what a rule out is.
Are there specific rule outs for battered women syndrome or PTSD?
Sure. So there's rule outs for everything, because you're considering a number of different conditions before you make a differential diagnosis, or you pick that's the one that I think best fits this person. So yes, there's rule outs for both of those.
For my sake, what is a differential diagnosis?
That's how you decide which one. It's whether it's your medical doctor, your psychologist, whoever. It's how they pick the right diagnosis. So you're going through kind of a card catalog in your head, and you're saying, all right, there's symptoms of this, but that's also consistent with symptoms of that. So is it schizophrenia? Is it bipolar disorder? Now I have to ask more questions. It's a decision tree. And that decision tree helps you to inform the person and either make a diagnosis in a legal setting or help to treat them clinically.
Now, if the individual, the psychologist is doing the evaluation, identifies the presence of certain rule outs, what is their response professionally to those rule outs in establishing or assessing the patient?
You have to go down a decision tree. And we all kind of do decision trees in our mind every day about what we should do or shouldn't do in certain situations. It happens automatically. It's more structured when you're doing it professionally. So if you have a concern about substances, then you would kind of take that track and you'd have to ask a lot of questions in that area. So you'd want to know what kind of substances, how often are they using those substances, what kind of effect have those substances had on them before. I just picked one of many possible rule outs there. But every one of them you'd have to explore or ask additional questions, because, of course, you don't want to come up with a wrong diagnosis, because in a legal setting, that leads you to a bad opinion. In a clinical setting, it leads to bad treatment.
Now, I want to go back just a second. We talked about the subjective nature of the the abused individual's understanding of what's happening. Does this subjective or does the experience that they have suffered result in, on occasion, their experiencing or their anticipating or assuming or imagining a threat that others may not?
Yes, sir.
Objection to approach.
Yes.
All right. So his
A
testimony,
threat
I wonder,
that others anticipating or
I wonder if the jury tuned parts of it out, but I want to hear the question one more time and then we can zoom through the sidebar.
assuming or imagining a threat that others may not?
Yes, sir.
Objection to approach.
Yes.
So the state is going to be very careful about what comes in, about what evidence comes in. And she's just sitting there laughing and cordial. I did link Dr. G Explains video. He covered her testimony from yesterday and mentioned there were times on her direct where she looked at the camera. She makes eye contact with the camera at certain points. And so I do have that video on my community tab if you missed his coverage. His videos are normally like 15 to 20 minutes. And he does
Objection is
great in
sustained.
that.
Doctor, from what you described this morning, I think we're talking about a complex and sophisticated process for assessing and diagnosing PTSD, battered women, the matters that you described. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, sir.
And in this instance, this particular matter regarding the state versus Sarah Boone, were you approached about the possibility of doing an assessment as to Sarah Boone?
They're going to object.
Approach.
So I don't think they had time to get all of his testimony. I think they didn't end up having time. I'm trying to close out some of my stuff so that, because I can see my stream lagging a little bit on my end. I don't know if it's laggy on y'all's end too. Yes, Dr. G. A duping, some of the duping delight smiles. I don't know if the jury was present. Maybe they were, but I missed her looking at the camera. So he caught that and I totally missed it. Yeah, some people are concerned that there is a DV survivor on the jury. I think the prosecution, if the other jurors saw that person get excluded, I think the fact the prosecution is okay with that. I wonder how that will speak, how that will do. Because I do think this was mutual. I don't think it was just
Objections.
George. I don't think it was just Sarah. Okay, they're talking.
Doctor, when you are retained to do an evaluation in these matters, what is your practice in regards to the assessment proceedings, the assessment efforts?
Well, I'd first want to know what type of an assessment that it is, because there's different methods of approach that you'd use to analyze and be able to give an opinion on whatever question's being asked of you. So the very first goal for me as a forensic psychologist is to isolate what the question is. So what are they asking me to do? Because I want to know, A, can I do that? Am I qualified to do that? Or should I refer that to somebody else? Or B, is that something I'm going to have enough time to do and enough resources to do? Then the next thing I would do is start asking questions about specifically what do you already have or what can you get to help me answer this question. So right away, I'd start to find out what's available. As forensic psychologists, we're supposed to do comprehensive evaluations of whatever the legal issue or question is, and it's supposed to rely on multiple sources of information. So depending again upon the question, I'm trying to then define early on what are those multiple pieces of information I'm going to need to help to try to give an opinion and a educated opinion about that matter.
Have you done an assessment in this particular case?
No, sir.
Can you tell us very briefly whether that was your decision?
Objection, relevance.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Move on.
Objection sustained.
In your experience, doctor,
Thank you very much.
can battered women syndrome rear its ugly head? For instance, when there are threats to other members of the family, two-legged or four?
So yes, that's very common that it's not just the person. It increases the terror from someone who's doing the abuse to mention other family members that they might also suffer abuse. So whether it's emotional or physical, those type of things are very common. Not always, but it's very common in the course of domestic violence cases or intimate partner violence cases.
And that fear that's developed by the abused individual may exist contemporaneously with other issues, alcoholism, schizophrenia, and the like. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. They can all be combined together. And certainly that increases if there's other family members that are threatened or live in the same home or close by. That can increase the terror. The purpose of that is to increase control, to make sure the abuser has more control over the person who's being abused.
1 second, Your Honor. May I?
Yes, sir.
So,
I wonder if Dr. Harper is testifying today. Jules is reporting that the defense might rest today, which was okay.
in doing an assessment, doctor, do you look at outside materials?
Yes, sir, always.
And what kind of outside materials do you necessarily review in order to make this assessment?
Specifically to battered woman syndrome.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So specific to this, you'd want to look at a lot of different sources of information because you're trying to, make a diagnosis if there's a trauma-related disorder, but you're also trying to figure out if there's the other elements necessary to make the diagnosis as well, like abuse that's been chronic over a period of time, and that the person feels they can't leave that situation, and if other people have been threatened. So you'd want to know things like not only what the facts are of the particular incident, usually some crime that's been committed, but you'd want to know the history of those behaviors. Has anyone else seen those? Are there people you can talk to? You know, friends, neighbors, bosses, anybody who's seen or heard of this abuse before? Have there been medical visits where the person has actually been damaged and shown up, made some other excuse, they slipped or fell or whatever it might be? You'd want to do psychological testing as a forensic psychologist, because we have very good tests that help us to determine whether someone's suffering from a trauma-based disorder or not. You'd want to know if the person who'd been accused of the crime for this type of evaluation made any statements to the police. If they did, you'd want to hear that statement. Or has there been a 911 call or calls? If that's happened, you'd want to hear that too. So any evidence you could collect, and these are some of those questions I was talking to you about before, you'd want to ask the person who's trying to hire you in the beginning, well, tell me what you have, because you'd want to see whether or not you're going to be able to make this analysis or not. So it's not good enough just to talk to the person, because that's just one form of information. It's almost like being a behavioral detective, if you will, as a forensic psychologist, because we're trying to get as much evidence wrapping around our interview with the person as possible to be able to guide our questions, but inform us and see whether there's what we call convergent validity. It's a fancy way of saying, does everything agree with each other? Does everything connect in a way that it all sort of makes sense? Or are these strange conflicting pieces of evidence that we need to explain away, or it just doesn't fit the criteria? So it's a rather comprehensive and complex evaluation that has to be conducted to come up with this. And the final piece I'd say about it is that Because oftentimes the abused person is defending still the person that they've oftentimes committed a crime against, it takes a bit of time to get to where you need to go. With all victims of trauma, whether you're talking about situations where you're doing therapy or you're doing an analysis in this type of setting, a criminal setting, it usually takes some time to break through that and get them to trust you to talk about the trauma, but to stop defending the person and talk about the abuse and how they felt about the abuse. Your goal, if you will, is to be able to see what's happening in that situation through the abused person's eyes. If you look at it through your eyes, often it doesn't seem to make sense. But if you look at it through their eyes, if it meets the criteria for a battered spouse, then you can better understand their world and what they're dealing with.
And real briefly, some of the things that you are evaluating when you examine, particularly the individual themselves, you're looking for anxiety and or fear,
Yes.
low self-esteem.
Yes.
Are you looking for depression?
Yes.
Are you looking for any form of social or interpersonal withdrawal?
Withdrawal, especially if it's forced withdrawal, controlled withdrawal, if there's consequences to socializing with my family, my friends, calling them on the phone, texting them. So especially in that context.
Stockholm syndrome.
Sure, that can be part of it.
And what is Stockholm syndrome, real briefly?
So it's really adapting to someone who's captive or taking over a person, controlling their life, sort of adapting to that situation. The famous model of that would be many, many decades ago, a woman called Patty Hearst, who was kidnapped. But it's taking on the beliefs and taking on an acceptance, if you will, of a kind of a captive situation. And in these situations with women who have been abused, who meet the criteria for battered spouse syndrome, they oftentimes adapt, defend, and take on in an acquiescent way that this is okay and I'm part of this situation as opposed to the situation.
Will this syndrome exhibit itself in physical attributes?
It can, at times, even physical illness at times.
Inability to sleep, inability to keep food down, and those type of things.
Sure. Yes, sir.
Would that individual potentially experience hypervigilance?
Well, that's a large part of it. Of any trauma-based disorder is hypervigilance. What changes when you've been traumatized, any kind of trauma, not just abuse, but what changes is your perception of danger. So whether it's the lid of the garbage can hitting you on your nose, or whether it's someone being abusive towards you, those situations change your perception of danger. So you no longer see that object or that person in the same way. You have a foreboding sense of danger could occur. So other people may not perceive it with that person. He's so nice at work, or he's nice in these other settings, or he's so great on the softball field, but at home he's different. So that person who's being abused, their perception changes.
Does that include denial?
It could include denial, and oftentimes that's part of the explanation. The defensiveness of that person is the denial of how bad things are that are going on.
Thanks, Doctor. For this time.
Any cross-examination?
Yes, sir. Morning, doctor.
Good morning.
Nice to see you in person.
Good to see you again.
So there's a subjective component to trauma, is what I understand you're saying, correct?
Always. Yes, sir.
And so hypothetically, a couple could be in a 3.5-year relationship with physical violence, emotional violence, even sexual violence. But either or both of those partners may or may not believe that is a traumatic experience for him or herself, correct?
Yes, sir. People mistake the stimulus about what happens as the trauma. The trauma is really the reaction to it. So bad things that happen, people don't always react in the same way to them. So yes, sir, that's correct.
So for instance, a homicide.
So we went into this yesterday talking about how
Detective or a homicide prosecutor may go out to a scene and see a freshly dead body.
my system is lagging just a little. Sorry about that. With this case and in yesterday's long video. So I have a segment called, it's about 5, because the whole video was 5 hours of live streaming. because we were trying to wait for Sarah's testimony. But I do have a segment called Trauma in the Brain. And we talked about how trauma impacts a person's nervous system. It ends up overwhelming their body. I do think they both use substances to kind of cope with stress and to kind of cope with situations. But I think the substances also increased their volatility. But it sounds mutual to me. And so we'll see where the prosecution is going with this.
And their perception of that environmental stimulus may be very different from somebody who works at Dunkin' Donuts and just gives us muffins in the morning coming across a dead body. Is that fair?
Yes, sir. That homicide detective may be able to go eat lunch right after it, and the other person who works at the donut restaurant may not be able to eat for a couple of days as a result. So yes, perception is a big part of how trauma occurs.
And I understand your answers today, and I'm not saying that they were different the other day, but I understand you to say that it's very important to do a comprehensive evaluation to get the full picture of what is going on in the perceived battered spouse's mind. Correct?
When we approach.
Yes.
Uh-oh. That's what he just said. I guess his answer today, because the state has done a deposition of him.
Could possibly have.
Let me go back.
So we've been talking about the importance of doing a comprehensive evaluation with as many collateral sources as one could possibly have when making an assessment about the battered spouse syndrome, correct?
Yes, sir. It's a relevant piece of information. Yes, sir.
And would you agree that obviously the person who is accused of committing a crime, there are credibility issues that you do need to care for when relying upon that person's history provided about the events leading to that and the past events describing the relationship with the intimate partner?
Yes, sir. In every forensic evaluation, that's the case.
Is this particularly important if there's a comorbidity with an alcohol abuse disorder?
Yes.
And can you tell the jury what alcohol abuse disorder means in the DSM-5 TR?
Sure. It's the biggest part of it is it's not just the use of alcohol, it's impairment that happens as a result. So it's the excessive use of alcohol, but that could mean something different, just like the excessive use of marijuana might mean. But it's the use of alcohol to the degree that it impairs or infects a person's life. And with that may come a lot of other things like deceitfulness or aggression or unreliability, sleep or somatic problems, difficulties. So, but the important thing to remember there is that it's the use of a substance that impairs or affects a person's life.
And if there is alcohol involved in the histories being given about either the event in question or any preceding events, must the evaluator take that into account when evaluating the memories and perceptions of the person giving them that history?
Yes. So in introducing that new topic about memory, we know that substances can interfere and impair memory. So as a result of that, you want to know what they were using, how close it was. If you're talking about a particular event like a crime, you'd want to know if there was substance usage, and if so, what the person's memory functioning was, and does that match up with other sources of information about what those events were.
Are you familiar with the narcissistic personality disorder?
Yes, sir, of course.
Is that something recognized in the DSM-5 TR?
Yes, sir.
And can you tell us whether or not a person who is giving a history, whether it's the patient/client or whatnot, has traits, perhaps not a diagnosis, but even just traits of the narcissistic personality disorder? Is that something the evaluator should account for in evaluating the credibility of the history given?
Yes.
Yes.
And why is that?
Well, because all forms of disorders or conditions or just traits may lead to inaccurate information, either not purposely or purposely. They may be deceptive. So certain personality disorders or traits can lead to deception or inappropriate or inaccurate information. That's why you need more than one source of information. Does what this person's saying to me check out with other sources of information?
And I don't mean to quiz you on it, but can you tell us some of the...
So the reason why he was not able to evaluate her, number one, he went on court TV and talked about the fact that this likely wasn't like how he had trouble wrapping his mind around this as self-defense because of the method used. I might have to play that clip. If I end up with extra time, I might have to find that clip of him on court TV talking about this particular case. And I love that the prosecution is bringing up narcissistic personality traits because to me, the way that Sarah described her love for George and why they loved each other and what she saw in him, like we had the same interests, but like what interest in alcohol? Like I don't like she everything was about her. And she is, in my opinion, physically harming him, and she's saying, "Stop doing this to me." Like that is gaslighting at its finest. So he is an expert. Dr. Brannon is a recognized expert in Florida for uh, battered spouse syndrome. He was one of the experts. So there was a recent case in Florida. Owens brought it up multiple times. I think it was in August. I think it was in August. A woman was acquitted of murder. She was in a very, very unsafe relationship, and she pew-pewed the monetization is probably gone for this video anyway. She shot and killed her husband. She shot him, I think, 5 times in the back, and she was exonerated. And Owen specifically wanted this guy. And he said when he was trying to get Dr. Brannon, Owens kept mentioning the fact that his testimony was critical and that other lady not being found guilty. But like she was in a, a, a clearly abusive marriage. It was really hard for her to leave. He might have been asleep or something, and that was the part. There was no imminent threat in that moment, but in her mind, there was, and the jury found her not guilty. And so that's why they wanted this particular expert to just talk about battered spouse in general. He can't talk about Sarah because he never saw her. And honestly, so really has had 45 days. And normally for a forensic evaluation, you need like at least a few weeks. Like you would need a lot of time to be able to complete the evaluation. Dr. Harper had already met with Sarah Boone 4 times over the years before Owens was involved. So they had Dr. Harper, who is also a forensic psychologist, but I don't know that she's as well respected as Dr. Brannon. So I think he is very well respected, and he might not have accepted the case. Like he might have done the evaluation and then went to the defense and like I can't say because you don't pay for testimony. Like experts to me should be honest, and if I don't think it meets criteria, then the state probably doesn't, or the defense, they probably wouldn't want to call me. So that's where we are with this. Bree Con. I think I covered that one too. But all right, we're gonna keep going.
Criteria for the narcissistic personality disorder?
I can, yes, sir. So it is a grandiose sense of self-worth. It's the consideration of yourself over anybody else. It's kind of operating in your own world. So it's an inflated sense of who you are. It's a misperception of how important you are to other people and your meaning to other people. It's a sense of specialness, that you stand out from other people in terms of special skill or skills, and that other people, if they don't recognize that, they should recognize that. So the biggest heading there is an inflated sense of self-esteem and grandiosity.
Are you familiar with an adjustment disorder diagnosis?
Yes, sir.
And is that in the DSM-5 TR?
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Correct.
Can you tell us about that?
Adjustment disorder is a person's reaction, and it could be emotional, it can be behavioral, or it can be both, to a situation that occurs. You broke up with your boyfriend or girlfriend, so you're upset about that. And so as a result, you're tearful, you're anxious or nervous or worried about what may happen to you as a result of breaking up with them, or you behaviorally may start not going to work, or get into more arguments or fights with your children as a result. So it's a temporary reaction to a stressful situation that occurs in some individuals.
And hypothetically, if a person who is giving a history for criteria of diagnosis, let me strike that. If somebody is giving a history and that is being used to come to an evaluation conclusion of battered spouse syndrome, if that person has been diagnosed with adjustment disorder predating the traumatic relationship, is that something the evaluator should take into account?
You'd want to know any prior diagnosis, because it may not necessarily be exclusionary, but it could. So adjustment disorder is a temporary reaction. You're upset in a temporary period, and most of them just go away on their own. Whereas something else like a traumatic stress disorder is long-term. It's something that person's stuck with for a period of time that usually doesn't just go away on its own. So yes, you'd want to know that for that term I used before, that differential diagnosis. You'd want to know those things to compare and contrast them and hold them up against each other.
All right. We are here for the questions, okay? Dr. Berry, can someone with a poor sense of a poor self-esteem, self-worth use having appearance of grandiosity to cover their poor sense of self? So this is the narcissist's secret. So any person that has narcissistic personality disorder, they don't actually, in their subconscious, they don't believe that they're as good as they portray to be. It is all an act. They are trying to fool everyone because it's it's not particularly helpful. Um the term the term narcissist comes from the Greek. It's a Greek god Narcissus. It's a guy that fell in love with his reflection. There are also tellings of this mythology, Greek mythology, where he actually dies because he's so in love with with himself that he does not eat. And to me, that is pathological. Like that is not healthy. That is an unstable and an unsafe sense of self. And to me, if I actually feel good about myself, I don't have to make you feel bad about you. So if I feel good about me, I don't need to put you down. So individuals with narcissistic traits, they often try to change your perception of what they did to you. So at narcissistic abuse, narcissistic harm, Dr. Ramani, I have her channel linked in my recommended channels. She is an expert in the field on healing from this type of harm. What she talks about is that it is so antagonistic that it often makes the victim of this type of harm, they question everything. And that's why Dr. Ramani's book, it's called It's Not You. Because often the people who are victims of this type of harm, they often feel like they're nothing. They're often emotionally and psychologically, they're often harmed, verbally abused. They often are, by that individual who is breaking them down to build themselves up. So pathological is, so that's like pathology. That's a problem. It's going to cause dysfunction. So when I say that sense of self is pathological, I mean that's not healthy. That's not a safe person. That's not a safe sense of self. Now, can people heal? Can individuals with narcissistic traits, can they change? But they have to want to. And um sometimes their behavior has been rewarded, or it's been, I don't know. So I often work with individuals, like with their children, with their partner. I often work with the individuals who have been harmed by individuals with those traits. I have rarely had someone with those traits present for treatment unless it was court ordered. And I stopped doing court ordered treatment. I think about August. I stopped all court ordered evaluations. Now it is normal for teens to have some, like, because their personalities have not formed, have not fully formed. Now, individuals who later do crime or later have issues, sometimes we can look back at their childhood and notice some problems, but there can be other kids that have those same problems that don't end up on that, excuse me, on that same path, that don't end up on that same trajectory. And so I hope that's helpful. Let me know if y'all have questions as we're listening. That is why we are here. Court is currently on break until 12:50 for anybody that's monitoring live court. Oh, all right, let's go.
Now, hypothetically, if somebody says things like, I'm the best thing that has ever happened to you, and I'm the best you'll ever do, are those indications of the narcissistic personality disorder?
Well, they could be. You wouldn't want just that alone. You'd want to see if that was happening in other settings. Is it happening on the job, with friends, with family members? Is it showing up on psychological testing? But certainly that would be a red flag. You'd go, I want to pay more attention to that. I want to investigate that further.
And is it important when evaluating trauma-based disorders, because they're based on emotional reactions, to do that rule out on alcohol or drug use?
Certainly you'd want to do that. It's not usually disguised as a trauma-based disorder. Alcohol and trauma aren't usually rule outs for each other, but it could exacerbate a condition. It could make you diagnose a trauma condition when it's just an adjustment disorder. I say just, I don't mean to minimize it, but it's not as serious as a trauma-based disorder.
Is it important to consider whether the abuser and or the abused behave differently in the absence of alcohol or drugs?
Yes.
And why is that?
Well, because you're trying to analyze a psychological condition. If as a result of drug or alcohol abuse, their behavior changes or their perceptions change, that's not a psychological condition, that's a substance abuse disorder. So that's why you'd want to know that. So if their condition remains the same, maybe it's a little worse when they're using drugs or alcohol, but it's the same perception of threat or danger, then you're going to diagnose a trauma-based disorder. If not, then you're going to diagnose a substance abuse disorder. You can have both, but you'd want to rule one out as opposed to the other.
And are you familiar with the classic three-step cycle of battered spouse syndrome or domestic violence?
Yes, sir, I
Can
am.
you explain that to the jury?
Sure. So there's a cycle of violence that was first developed by a woman in the 70s called Lenore Walker, Dr. Lenore Walker. She's a psychologist who's usually credited with developing the whole theory of battered spouse syndrome. And in the classic model, which we know oftentimes happens, not every time, but in the classic model, there's a period of tension buildup where things are happening, little arguments are happening, there's bickering back and forth, there may be some threats or some loud voices back and forth, but it's all things that are leading up to a possible violent episode. Then there's the episode that happens itself, the violent episode. It could be verbal, sexual, physical, but there's the violent incident that occurs. And then after that violent episode occurs, there's a honeymoon phase where the person who's done the abuse, they're apologizing, taking that person who was abused out to dinner, buying them things, saying nice things to them, complimenting them to sort of make up for the abuse. And it's it's called the cycle of violence. And the reason why is it tends to repeat itself in a lot of these situations of battered spouse syndrome, where you see this repeating itself over and over and over again. So people are kind of stuck in these revolving doors in their relationship.
And can one cycle be enough to traumatize a person?
Yes.
Does this trauma necessarily have to be coming from a man to a woman?
No.
And in fact, as times have changed, language has changed. And so when we...
Welcome. So I am a clinical psychologist. I am not forensic. So Dr. G Explains is a forensic psychologist. I am clinical. So I've only been brought into state court. So for family court. So I've been brought in to for termination of parental rights, both called by the defense and also by the, I guess, defense, and also by the state. I used to do intensive home-based therapy. So with a lot of those cases, because I also used to do therapeutic supervised visitation or just supervised visitation. And so with a lot of those cases, I would get pulled into court. I've also had clients that their mental health came up as an issue, and I've been called into court for issues like that. It was normally juvenile, never adult court. I've also done evaluations for court ordered evaluations for juveniles and for teens. So teens or children. I've done court ordered evaluations for teens or kids and also for adults, but I don't do parenting capacities. So in the United States, we have something called a parenting capacity, which assesses a person's ability to parent. And I don't do those forensic evaluations of, is this person not guilty by reason of insanity, or, do they meet criteria, are they competent to stand trial? Those would be forensic evaluations. I hope that's helpful. Let's keep it going.
Keep referring to it as battered woman syndrome in the courtroom today. What we're actually talking about now is battered spouse syndrome, or even intimate partner violence.
Yes, so I mean, interpartner violence can happen outside of legal settings, but it's really a kind of the large over grouping, if you will, to be able to talk about all of these other things that can happen as a result, like trauma-based disorders and battered spouse syndrome. And you're right, the later research has kind of pulled us away from thinking this only happens to women in heterosexual relationships. We know now there's all sorts of derivations, and that men can suffer also from battered spouse syndrome, battered person syndrome, homosexual couples. So we know it goes around to everybody, but still, women are more often diagnosed with battered spouse syndrome than anybody else.
Does the trauma have to come in the form of physical violence?
No, sir.
Does it have to come in the form of sexual violence?
No, sir.
Can it come in the form of emotional or mental violence?
Yes, sir.
And would examples of that include such as running the partner down and telling them that they're no good, and, just general insulting and lowering their value?
It could. Remember, that's the stimulus, so it would depend on how the person who's receiving that responds to it as to whether or not it becomes traumatic. But yes, sir, that'd be the first red flag you'd want to investigate.
And you mentioned isolation before. So if somebody in a hypothetical intimate partner setting is trying to isolate the partner from his or her family members or friends or coworkers, can that be, and I'm not saying necessarily, can that be indications of intimate partner violence that could lead to battered spouse syndrome?
So sure, that'd be an example of coercive control. So if a person was doing that, that's consistent with that classification of battered person syndrome. Yes.
And hypothetically, controlling another person, the intimate partner's personal property or effects, such as a birth certificate or identification papers, can that be indication of emotional trauma towards the partner who is lacking the control over those identification papers?
So that's a stimulus that could result, depending on how the person subjectively perceives it, in some trauma. So yes, all of the things that you mentioned could be stimulus, if you will, that a person could perceive as traumatic.
And hypothetically, if one partner A gives partner B a gift, such as a bicycle, but partner A continues to maintain that the bicycle is his or hers because he or she bought it, even though it was a gift to B, can that be a form of emotional abuse?
So people can touch their hair a lot anyway. To me, it's just interesting that she starts grooming a little, because they are asking about things that Sarah has likely done. These hypotheticals are likely things that the state has evidence that she has done.
Towards B.
Sure, it sounds like control, but I guess you could interpret it as emotional abuse too. But it sounds more like a control mechanism that'd be consistent.
I'm not suggesting that it's legally or morally okay, but when one intimate partner does these hypothetical emotional things, non-physical violent things to partner B, if partner B has poor personal skills and coping skills and may be consuming alcohol, is it unreasonable or unfathomable to hear that partner B responded with physical violence to partner?
Objection, assuming facts not in evidence.
Yeah. That was a good objection. That was a good objection. But I think it applies to this situation. I think it applies.
Question, please go ahead.
Objection is overruled.
So may I respond to that?
If you remember the question, please go ahead.
So it would increase the probability of physical violence. So if those things in fact were perceived as threatening or abusive in any way or insulting to the person who they were directed towards, it would increase the probability of physical violence.
And then again, the perceptions are all in the eye of the beholder, whether emotional things that are said to one another or physical things are done to one another, whether the recipient of that behavior views it as trauma is a subjective decision by that person. Right?
Yes, the perception is the impact. So that's how you would know that it's just, water off a duck's back, or is it something that's kind of sticks with me and I think about it all the time?
Now, you mentioned earlier Anxiety, low self-esteem, and depression can all be components of battered spouse syndrome, correct?
Correct.
Is it important as the evaluator to rule out whether or not these conditions predated the violent or abusive relationship?
Yes.
Yes.
And why is that?
Well, because where things start is important diagnostically. So if all of those things are in place, all of the symptoms that were just mentioned are in place, then you wouldn't attribute those.
The state is doing a phenomenal job because Sarah's control and alcohol problem was before she met George, but the jury doesn't know that. So always remember, we know more than the jury knows, and we know some things the jury will never know. And so
To the abuse. You'd say those things were pre-existing. Now, abuse could make it worse, but in terms of your diagnosis, you'd need to know where things started. So if those symptoms didn't start at the time where there was abuse that was alleged to have occurred, then it's unlikely that it's attributed to that abuse.
And independent of any narcissistic personality
They definitely
disorder
are.
traits, would you agree that anybody in a certain legal setting has a motivation to present themselves in a certain way?
yes,
Yes, to do impression management, either depending on the outcome. So if there's punitive sanctions, they may lie to make themselves look worse, or as a result, if they're in other settings like divorce settings, they may lie to make themselves look better. So there's always some impression management you have to kind of look through in your evaluation.
And that's important for an evaluator.
It should be looked at in every evaluation.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Any redirect examination?
Yes, Your Honor.
impression management. Yes.
Just want to, one more time, in response to the state's questioning, you indicated that where an individual's credibility may be in question, there is a necessity that the individual who's making the assessment corroborate whatever they're being told. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, in a number of different ways. We have psychological tests that assess for things called malingering or faking mental health problems or difficulties. So you'd want to do that. You'd want to look at other evidence to see if it's all consistent. So it's very important you don't just rely on self-report.
Is it possible that an individual may exhibit one or two attributes of a particular DSM diagnosis, but not actually qualify because it's simply not there?
Right, sure. So sometimes like social isolation can be because we're introverted, or it could be part of depression. So you need to kind of follow it out and see how many of the symptoms are there to see whether or not it meets the criteria.
So I may exhibit one or two symptoms of narcissism, but not qualify because I don't meet all of those, or a significant number of the indicators that you would rely upon to make that diagnosis.
Yes, sir. Or it can be situationally based, like we may display narcissistic features here in a courtroom, but may not do that in any other part of our life.
Now, in your experience, have you determined, learned, either through your studies, experience, and so on, whether or not the abusive behavior may begin based upon an individual's perception of things occurring to him as a child or
What?
her as a child? In other words, if they grow up in an abusive household,
Where did that come from? Her history of childhood trauma has not, like, she lost her parents, but no history of childhood trauma has come up yet. Did she bring up childhood trauma with Dr. Harper? No history of childhood trauma has. Now that would make sense for the development of a possible personality disorder, but like that seemed out of left field. We haven't heard anything about childhood trauma yet.
Okay, I understand.
Objection, hypothetical, not necessary.
Yeah.
Sustained.
you've indicated that there are things
Because nobody said anything about childhood trauma. Nobody. They should have talked about that if they wanted, because we know Sarah's behavior predates George. It just does.
that I think in response to the state's cross-examination, that there are things that may add to or may contribute to a particular psychosis or symptom. Would an individual's background as a child include those type of criteria?
Yes, sir. You're more vulnerable to certain psychological conditions based on your history. So if you've been traumatized before, or bad situations have happened to you before, if you've suffered from depression before, it makes you more vulnerable to those conditions or other conditions later on.
Finally, one question or one symptom that we haven't discussed, I don't think, or maybe it was discussed by the state, was learned helplessness. What is that?
Yeah, we didn't talk about that.
Learned helplessness, I've really spoken about it a little bit, but now we have the fancy term for it. Learned helplessness was really.
So I've talked on my channel about learned helplessness before. They started with a horrific dog. I don't know if he's going to go into the dog experiment. Trigger warning for harm to dogs if he does mention that one. When I look at Sarah's situation, I don't see learned helplessness for her. I could potentially see it for George. I don't see it for Sarah, because I don't see it, but it is what it is.
Researched by someone named Seligson, a doctor named Seligson, a psychologist, research psychologist. And just real briefly, what it is, it's when someone kind of gives up and feels like there's nothing that they can do to change their situation. It was originally done with laboratory animals, but where a person really feels that no matter what strategy they've taken, like leave, stay, fight, whatever it might be, it won't work. It usually leads to depression or developments of other strategies, like I have to appease or please or make sure I do everything correctly or apologize. So it's really believing that no matter what you do, it won't be effective.
Doctor, thank you for your testimony. Thank you for
Sure.
traveling up here from Miami so early in the morning.
No problem at all.
Thanks for the rest.
Thank you, sir. You can be excused.
Thank you, Your Honor.
All right. So I just started a poll. Do you think this witness helped the defense or the state more, or neither? So did it help the defense, the state, both, neither? And I do think there's more things coming forward. So I wish I had like a add-on. I'm still watching because I don't know. I did hear that they had testimony about the bat. So I missed the pictures of George hitting the damaged TV, and the defense had the did the digital forensic expert come back so that they could play the video of George smashing the TV. So let's watch it, and then we can talk about it. Trigger warning for property damage.
Play exhibit 17 first,
You may proceed.
and is there a volume? Judge, do you have control of volume?
Volume is on.
Nice background.
You're gonna help me take this shit out. Real shit. You're gonna help me take it out. You're gonna help me take this shit out. That's how I want to.
Okay. I want to see if there's another.
You may proceed.
I want to see if there's another video. Nope, I think that was it. Okay, so that was a video of George. I don't think it's a good idea to start recording somebody who might be being aggressive or things like that. If people are in an unsafe situation, please get safe. Oh, there was a second video. Okay, let me find it. Maybe I didn't have them both. Let me see if I can find. Okay, okay. I see it. Okay. Let me share my screen again. We like this view. Okay. Let's do this one. Sorry. I think this might be the second one. Okay. Y'all let me know your thoughts in the chat on that one. I don't know what happened before and after that. Oh. So I'm laughing. So these things are not funny. I one of my best friends, her husband is a big sports. He's a big Minnesota Vikings fan. And like when he gets rage when they lose. Like he screams. Now he's safe. He's not an unsafe person, but like he goes when they're not doing well, he gets really very, very upset. And Jay Denise, I would want to know the context. I don't hear her telling him to stop. I don't hear her saying, please don't do this. Like, just put it down. Or I don't like, she's just quiet as she's recording him damaging the TV. And he said, you're going to help me with this. But that's where I don't know what happened. I need more context to this. This video could potentially hurt her case because I think the still pictures of what he did, but I think they're trying to make him look like an aggressive monster. And I have questions about what happened. I do think their relationship was toxic. I personally feel like it was mutual. Um it's so hard when you have zero context for this situation. Haha, school. Like he's a huge like he has a Vikings room. He just went to the game and he wears his Viking outfit. Um and yes, he has so he's a medical doctor and wears I think he has purple scrubs if he has to work. So that's where it's like, was the TV broken? And it was like, hey, so they had an immature relationship, in my opinion. In my opinion, now couples can play games together, and that's not a problem. The way she described keeping him busy so he didn't drink, that came off incredibly codependent to me. And like, let's feel productive. Let's feel like we've accomplished something. That language sounded condescending to me. If my husband spoke to me in that way, we would be in some serious therapy, and because like that is incredibly condescending to me. It just is. So defense is saying that Brian bought the TV for Lucas. I also heard the allegation of her saying that like, he was mad because but when they fought, she ran to her ex. Like, I don't think his fear of her, like, going back to her ex, I don't think that was irrational. When they fought, she ran to him. And I love, love, love that the prosecution pointed out, "Ma'am, are we playing house rules?" Because so y'all know I have a 7-year-old, and when we play hide and seek, we don't even start with tag. Like we say, "Okay, I'll count first, But if we were to say tag you're it, that would mean you count, I go hide. Or if I, or like, her explanation of hide and seek does not make any sense. And the state, no joke, was like, are we playing house rules? Like, is that what we are doing here? Um, all right. So let's go ahead and end the poll. And can I see, so I'm in StreamYard and I can't see the poll results. I think it was 73% prosecution that this helped the prosecution. Let me see. Yes. So 73% that it helped the prosecution, 11% said both, 10% said neither, and 4% said that testimony helps Sarah, because it did introduce that there's this perception of what could happen. There are like rage rooms where you pay to go damage TV. Like they have broken TVs and you just go and you can just destroy everything in the room. That it's like a safe way to let out excess energy. Um, I don't know if that helped because she's standing there recording him. Oy. Let me know if y'all have any questions. I have a second question that I didn't answer. Do forensic psychologists and clinical psychologists need different certification? So most forensic psychologists are licensed as clinical psychologists. There are special forensic programs and there are special forensic certifications. So in my state, Virginia, there in order to call yourself a forensic psychologist, you should have a internship and like there are certain educational requirements that you should meet, and then there are certain practice certifications that you should complete in order to call yourself a forensic psychologist. But normally they're licensed as clinical psychologists. Psychology boards, that's normally the option that's offered for most boards. In my state, school psychologists are licensed through, I'm almost but I think it might be still the Board of Psychology, but it's looked at as more of an educational, like the requirements are different for school psychologists. And so yes, all right. And so Emily said this was reminiscent of Amber filming Johnny Depp for fodder. Yes. Um, and that's where her recording of her injuries. So I mentioned this in Uncivil Law's chat earlier today. So Uncivil Law has been streaming. Emily D. Baker is streaming. There are all these phenomenal people streaming today. That I mentioned that a lot of DV survivors don't take pictures of their harm because they are so ashamed. I have clients that I've worked with in the past. I don't have anyone current in any situations like that, but I've worked with clients in the past that would cancel a session with me if they had a visible bruise because of the shame. And it would take maybe like they would wait until everything had healed, and then when they came into session they would report what happened. Rarely did they report anything to the police, and we talked about how to get safe, stay safe. Nobody that I worked with, because if there are children exposed to that harm in my state, that is child abuse, and that's reportable to CPS. Children being exposed to DV, and so she almost seemed not proud, but like, I don't know, it's weird. But to me, Sarah desperately wants to be the victim. She wants people to feel sorry for her, and I do think it was bad. And also, I think she did a bad thing too. And I think there should be a consequence. That's just my own personal thought. All right. Dr. Barry, if you look at the first video, it was already broken. Yeah, seemed like an agreement to destroy the rest of it. I don't think George broke it. Oh my gosh. I don't know. Brian paid for her phone. Um, the filming was just so weird. And so all of this evidence, the jury will be able to go back and take a closer look at it if they need to. Aw, if my son tapped me and said, "Tag, you're it," means we're playing hide tag and not hide. Exactly. Exactly. Like my son would want me to chase him. And it wouldn't be a game like when we play hide and seek, he's like he'll ask to play hide and seek. He doesn't come up to me and say tag. Normally you tag if you have more than 2 people playing hide and seek. Because then as you find people, you're trying to tag them, and then that's the next person, that's it. That's I don't know. So I work with children and teens. That's been my specialty throughout my practice. In 2020, I switched to working more with adults. And you said bingo. Let me see if we got any cards. Okay. Um, oh my gosh. Okay. So on one of my cards, we got a hearsay objection. Sarah is the victim, a free space, Sarah smirk, and hide and seek. So on one of the cards, I do have Boongo going across. I'm wondering if I can get like a blackout, like if I can get a whole card. Yes. All right. Oh, it's very, very, but all right. Oh, your 6-year-old loves to be chased. Giggles are the best. So I chase my kiddo when I want him to go faster. So like if my kid is getting ready to slow in the morning, I'll be like, I'll race you. And he'll be like, and he'll go faster. Like, yes. I hope this works forever. And so she has not received any treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. So while she's in jail, so she's not on any medication for anxiety or depression. She is not on any medication, and it's my understanding, I don't believe she has been on any like any of that type of medication since she's been incarcerated. She's only been on the I think she has like a like stomach. She has stomach issues or something. Because the judge had her list her medications. Oh, yes. So Afton, yes. Her lack of reaction or emotions could be a trauma response. It could also be like sign of like it could also be a disconnect. Like so yes, it could be a trauma response. It seemed more performative to me. I think she wants to come off strong to the jury. Her testimony just seemed like it was an act to me, but that's just I say that a lot. I'm sorry, but that's just how I felt. That was how I felt. Yes, she's on blood pressure medication and I think something for reflux. I think so. Um, do, 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 do. Um, yeah. And so I didn't say this, but also people with psychopathic traits don't express emotions the same way. Sometimes there can be a void of emotion where you would expect it when there are some psychopathic type traits. I am so looking forward to the forensic psychiatrist from the state. I'm looking forward to that. Could it be a sign of narcissism? The lack of emotional response, yes. So I do feel like she was trying to play the role of a victimized person. I don't think she remembers what happened in those 9 minutes. I think she knew she needed to come up with something. I don't think she has memory. I think she had an alcoholic blackout. I don't think she remembers. That's just my own personal thought. Um so I think, but they have medical records of it as well. So we're not just remember, we're not only believing Sarah's self-report of her medications, because the defense was trying to enter some of her jail medical records, because that's where the state was like, I don't see any treatment for anxiety or PTSD. All I see is that she's on she's had COVID test, some things that you would expect for, he called her middle-aged. He did. And I'm 42. He said things that you would expect for a middle-aged woman. That's what he said. Um, so because remember, the defense did not cross-examine Brian. So when Brian was on the stand, the defense said they were gonna hold back on that. So I do think they're gonna go back. All right. Welcome, welcome. I love this community. If you're not subscribed, this is what we do here. I love building community. If you ask questions, like I try to see your questions and actually respond to them. And so yes, I watched it and I thought it was good. I also shared it on my community tab. If you have not seen a forensic psychologist take on Sarah's testimony, Dr. G Explains is a phenomenal YouTuber here. And I shared his video on my community tab. All right. So I'm going to get ready for my next client. I'm glad that I was able to hang out with you all for a little bit. I will be streaming tomorrow morning from about 10 a.m. until 1 p.m. And we'll see how much of everything we get through. If Dr. Harper, the defense expert, testifies today, I'm definitely going to cover that tomorrow morning, that and the cross-examination, and then we'll hop in to everything. If Brian talks, I definitely want to cover Brian's testimony as well. I hope y'all have a great rest of your day. Bye.